I never thought that the wedding of my own son would be the moment I stopped being a mother and became disposable in their eyes. The champagne flute was still in my hand when Belle, his fiancée, turned to the server and said just loud enough for everyone around to hear, "The help eats in the kitchen." She didn't even look at me. Her eyes flicked toward Elaine, my assistant for over 30 years, then past her straight through me, as if I were the wallpaper. My breath caught but my spine held. Around me a few guests tittered nervously. Some winced. One woman glanced down at her plate, pretending she hadn't heard. And my son, my Zach, the boy I carried through grief, through colic, through the 2008 market crash. He just adjusted his cufflinks and kept chatting with Belle's cousin about hedge funds. Elaine looked at me, stiff, her face unreadable. I gave her the smallest nod. It wasn't the first slight of the evening. No, the message had been building since the ceremony began. My name card didn't say Mother of the Groom. It said Margaret Sinclair. My favorite champagne had been replaced with Belle's so-called sustainable rose. And when I walked into the ceremony, I wasn't seated near my son, but 2 rows back while her spin instructor, sat up front as if he belonged to the family. But this humiliation, this was deliberate. And I was done. I set my glass down untouched on the white linen tablecloth. I reached into my clutch, stepped behind the garden's trellis wall. The cool evening breeze brushing against my cheek. Lavender bushes stirred at my feet. Behind me, the string quartet played a light jazz variation of Coldplay, as if nothing had shattered. But inside me, something sharp and steady had awoken. I dialed Victor. He answered on the second ring, ever punctual. "Cancel the $30 million contract my son was going to announce tonight," I said, my voice calm, surgical. There was silence. Then, "Maggie, you heard me," I interrupted. "It was mine to give. Now it's mine to keep." Victor didn't ask why. He never does. That's why I trust him. "Understood," he said quietly. "I'll notify the board immediately." I hung up my hand steady. Beside me, the roses had begun to wilt from the early summer heat. Plucked one. The outer petals were already soft, bruised. The bloom had been beautiful, perfect even, but its time was over. I returned to the table, spine straight, chin lifted. Elaine had refilled her glass, but hadn't touched it. She rose slightly as I approached, worry shadowing her eyes. "You're fine," I whispered, placing a hand on her shoulder. "They'll need your poise now more than ever." We both sat just as Zach stood, tapping his glass for the toast. "I just want to thank everyone for coming," he said, his smile dazzling beneath the garden lights. "Especially my mother, Margaret." His voice faltered. My name landed like a dropped fork. He had expected applause. He got silence. Even the quartet paused. I tilted my head just enough to catch his eye. His smile faltered. He cleared his throat. "Who helped make today possible?" Helped. Past tense. The boy who once cried into my blouse after losing a little league game now looked through me like I was a mirror with no reflection. Glasses clinked. Laughter filled the air. But the energy had shifted. Whispers began at the edges of the garden, subtle currents rippling outward. Mrs. Davenport didn't bother to hide her smirk. She leaned toward her companion and whispered something that made him glance at me. Good. Let them whisper. By dessert, they would realize the announcement was missing. The future Zach thought was guaranteed had evaporated. And none of them knew yet, but they would. People often think betrayal comes with shouting, with slammed doors or broken glass. But in truth, the worst kind slips in quietly, disguised as politeness, as progress, as the natural passing of a torch. That night, after the toast, I sat among glittering gowns and polished cufflinks, and what I felt was not rage. It was recognition. Recognition of how long I had allowed myself to be erased, inch by inch. I remembered when it all began. I was 27, newly divorced, carrying a 3-year-old boy on one hip and a mountain of debt on my back. His father hadn't died. No, that might have carried sympathy. He had simply walked away, leaving me with an empty apartment and the kind of silence that echoes louder than grief. So I built a life anyway. At the kitchen table while Zach slept, I sketched floor plans and furniture concepts on yellow pads. I convinced small restaurants to let me redesign their spaces. I measured wallpaper samples with one hand while rocking a stroller with the other. Slowly, painfully, Sinclair Design was born. Not as a legacy, not as a brand, but as survival. Zach grew up between stacks of blueprints, chasing toy cars across fabric swatches, calling my leather portfolio Mommy's secret suitcase. He would sit on the floor beside me and chatter about superheroes while I tried to calculate square footage. For years it was just us. I was his anchor and he was my reason. But empires once built attract other voices. By the time he had his MBA, Zach had learned to shake hands harder, smile brighter, and call me not Mom but Margaret. At a fundraiser, he introduced me to strangers as Margaret Sinclair, founder of Sinclair Design, as though I were a talking point on his resume. At first I laughed, flattered even. It took me months to realize that he wasn't joking. Somewhere between ambition and arrogance, he had rewritten me from mother into brand asset. And then came Belle. Smooth, polished, always posing for invisible cameras. She had no need for my guidance. At least that's what she said. When I offered to mentor her, she smiled with perfect teeth and replied, "We've hired someone younger, more in line with the brand's aesthetic." As if my hands, scarred from decades of work, were obsolete. As if wisdom had an expiration date. The erosion wasn't sudden. It was a slow excavation, every year another brick removed from the foundation I had poured. My signature wallpaper line rebranded as New Heritage, my credit erased. A legacy brunch, held at my own estate without so much as an invitation. Step by step they carved away my place, leaving behind only the part of me they wanted. The money, the name, the facade of family loyalty. That wedding, with its careful humiliations, wasn't the start of anything. It was simply the curtain rising on what had already been rehearsed for years. And as I sat there listening to the string quartet stumble back into their melody, I realized I wasn't mourning the sun I'd raised. I was mourning the silence I had mistaken for generosity. For too long I told myself stepping back was an act of love, that letting him lead was a gift. But love without boundaries isn't generosity. It's self-erasure. That night, in the garden lit by chandeliers strung through magnolia branches, I knew something vital. I hadn't lost my son at the altar. I had been losing him all along, every time I agreed to vanish a little more so he could shine brighter. And I was finished disappearing. The morning after the wedding I sat by the wide windows of my study, a porcelain cup of untouched tea cooling beside me, and I realized that for the first time in decades I was no longer grieving what I had lost but calculating what still belonged to me, because power, once recognized, cannot be unseen. The night before I had made one phone call and watched a $30 million future dissolve into smoke, and in that silence I rediscovered a part of myself I thought had withered. They believed my stillness was weakness, that age had made me irrelevant, that maternal love would keep me docile forever. But they forgot that I had once rebuilt a life from dust and unpaid bills, and that kind of resilience does not retire. So while Zach and Belle were still basking in the glitter of their curated vows, I summoned Victor again, this time not to cancel a contract but to redraw the architecture of control. One clause here, one signature there, and suddenly my son's influence was no longer concrete but paper-thin, an illusion propped up by assumptions. I instructed Victor to begin the quiet work of pruning him out of the operating trust, not with drama, not with confrontation, but with the precision of a surgeon removing a diseased limb before it poisoned the whole body. As he drafted the paperwork, I remembered the way Zach's voice had cracked during the toast, how he faltered when the room refused to clap, and I understood that doubt had already been planted. My task was simply to water it with strategy. That afternoon I walked through the garden, the same garden where they had posed for photographs, and every step past the roses and lavender felt like reclaiming territory. Elaine followed half a pace behind, steady as ever, her clipboard tucked under her arm, and when she asked quietly if I wanted to strike now or wait, I told her waiting was the strike. Silence makes people nervous, it makes them whisper, and whispers unravel reputations faster than scandal. That was the true weapon. By evening, word had already started to spread that the grand announcement Zach had promised investors had evaporated, and though my name was never mentioned, eyes began to turn toward me, calculating, remembering that empires are not inherited simply by wearing a tuxedo beside the right woman in a white dress. At dinner, I allowed myself a small ritual. I retrieved an old leather portfolio from my shelf, the same one Zach once called my secret suitcase, and I placed it on the table in front of me. Inside were sketches, contracts, ledgers, evidence of decades where I alone carried the Sinclair name forward. Running my hand across the worn leather, I promised myself I would not allow anyone, not even the boy I had raised, to strip that history into branding material. In that moment I was not vengeful, I was awake. People confuse vengeance with noise, but true reclamation moves quietly, changing structures while others are distracted by champagne bubbles. That night, while guests gossiped about missing announcements and Belle fussed about seating charts, I was already rewriting the future, clause by clause, signature by signature, ensuring that the next time my son looked out at a crowd expecting applause, he would find only the echo of his own voice. 2 days after the wedding, I found myself standing in front of the old vault at the estate, the one built by my grandfather, its steel door cold beneath my palm, and I thought about how many generations had trusted these walls to protect what mattered most: jewelry passed down through wars, documents that safeguarded land, letters written in faded ink, and it struck me that lineage is not a costume to be borrowed for photographs but a weight you must be strong enough to carry, and that was precisely why Belle's arrogance could not be ignored. She had adorned herself with my grandmother's sapphire ring and my mother's ivory comb without so much as a question, walking down the aisle glittering in borrowed power as though history itself were a fashion accessory. And I let it happen because sometimes you must allow people to show you who they are when they believe you will remain silent. But silence is not surrender, it is observation. And when the moment was right, I asked Elaine to go to the bridal suite and retrieve what belonged to us, not as a confrontation but as a correction. I imagined the scene even before she returned. Belle clutching the ring, her laughter pitched too high as she insisted it was a misunderstanding, stylist's frozen mid-curl, the atmosphere thick with the sudden awareness that the woman who had mocked me was nothing more than a guest draped in jewels that did not carry her bloodline. Elaine, ever composed, would not raise her voice. She would simply present the velvet pouch, steady and inevitable, and wait until the silence crushed the pretense. And Belle, forced to remove the ring slowly, each twist of the band a reminder that no matter how dazzling the gown, legacy cannot be stolen. It must be inherited with respect. When Elaine placed the pouch in my hands later that evening, I opened it under the lamplight of my study, letting the sapphire catch the glow like a star that had been hiding, and as I slipped the ring onto my finger I felt not triumph but clarity. This was not about possession, it was about restoration. That ring had survived wars, migrations, boardroom negotiations. It had been worn by women who signed contracts when men dismissed them, who raised children while balancing ledgers, who refused to vanish even when history tried to erase them. It was not meant for someone who saw it as a photo prop. The next morning I had the entire vault recatalogued, every heirloom logged and sealed, not out of paranoia but out of discipline, because stewardship of legacy requires vigilance. Elaine supervised the process with her usual precision, her notes as meticulous as a historian, and when she sealed the boxes in archival containers she looked at me and said softly that one day these would belong to someone worthy. I nodded, though I knew worthiness is not guaranteed by blood but by loyalty. Later, as the household bustled with post-wedding cleanup, I watched Belle float among guests still lingering for brunch, her smile brittle, her eyes darting, aware that something had shifted though she could not yet name it. Zach trailed beside her, overcompensating with laughter, pretending that the foundation beneath his feet had not begun to crack. And I, wearing no jewels except the sapphire on my own hand, moved through the garden with calm composure, invisible to some, unavoidable to others, because power reclaimed does not need to announce itself. It simply radiates until the air itself tastes different. That day I understood with final certainty that reclaiming my heirlooms was not about rings or combs but about rewriting the boundaries of respect, about showing them that what they dismissed as decoration was in truth the root of the empire. And from that moment forward I vowed that no one would wear the Sinclair legacy unless they carried its weight with honor. It was a week later when the next mask slipped, and it didn't happen in some boardroom or garden reception. It arrived in my inbox with the sterile subject line "Final confirmation of registry transfers," an innocuous message carrying a spreadsheet that looked like any other until I noticed the column labeled donor and saw my own name repeated again and again beside gifts I had never agreed to fund, a luxury travel account of $10,000, designer furniture credits, annual subscriptions for exotic floral deliveries, even a request for a private retreat priced at more than most families earned in a year, all attributed to me as if my existence were nothing more than a bottomless fountain of indulgence. And for a moment I simply stared, not in shock but in a kind of exhausted recognition, because this was not oversight, this was entitlement laid bare. I called Elaine into the study, slid the laptop toward her, and asked how many of these had been processed. She scanned the screen, her eyes narrowing, then answered that 3 transactions had already gone through while the rest were still pending. That was enough. I picked up the phone and asked Victor to place an immediate freeze on all wedding-related transfers citing discrepancies in authorization. He didn't hesitate, didn't ask questions. He knew when my tone carried no room for negotiation. By sunset the accounts were locked. What followed was not anger but ripples of discomfort. Belle didn't confront me directly. Of course not. Women like her prefer to send assistants armed with sugary emails that read like apologies but drip with expectation. Yet each message carried the same presumption, that money would flow again once a small clarification was made, that surely this was all a technical error. I replied only once through Elaine with 3 words: pending internal review. Silence is heavier than denial. By the next morning whispers had already reached the brunch tables where guests gathered for their final farewells, murmurs about a travel fund that mysteriously bounced, about vendors waiting for payment that never arrived, about the Sinclair generosity that suddenly seemed less certain. I didn't need to add my voice. Society knows how to chew on rumor without seasoning. Belle's smile grew tighter, her posture more rigid. Zach's laughter louder and hollower. The brittle performance of people who sense the tide turning but cannot command it back. Later that week, in the quiet of Victor's office, I went further. I asked him to begin amending the will, not to erase my son entirely. That would be too obvious, too easy to paint as cruelty, but to redirect the bulk of my estate toward something larger, something that could not be twisted by greed. Scholarships for young designers without privilege, housing funds for women rebuilding after loss, endowments that carried the Sinclair name not as a brand but as a promise. A smaller living trust would remain for Zach, enough so no one could claim I had disowned him, but never again the open vault he believed would always be his. Victor, pragmatic and loyal, drafted notes without commentary, though I saw the faintest glimmer of approval in his eyes. When I left his office that evening, the city lights glittered across the glass towers and I felt a strange calm, as though for the first time in years the air was clearing. They had mistaken my patience for weakness, my love for limitless supply, but what they didn't understand is that true legacy is not about providing endlessly, it is about protecting fiercely, and by cutting off their access I was not punishing them, I was preserving myself. It was late in the evening when the estate had finally grown quiet, the music gone, the tables cleared, the servants retreating to their quarters, and I was walking through the east corridor to fetch a shawl when I heard voices spilling through the half-open door of the bridal suite, voices I knew too well, low and sharp, carrying the cadence of conspiracy rather than intimacy, and I froze because instinct told me these were words not meant for daylight. Belle's tone came first, edged with disdain, accusing my son of failing to control me, of promising her that I would play the part of the gracious matriarch forever, smiling and silent, rolling over as they claimed what they believed was theirs, and then Zach's voice, quieter but harder, admitting that I had disrupted their plans, that half the guests were already questioning their image, and that something had to be done. I pressed my hand against the cool wall, steadying my breath, and listened as Belle whispered the most dangerous idea of all, that they only needed to wait, that at my age it would take just one slip, one confused statement in public, one forgotten pill, one manufactured moment of fragility, to present before a judge and strip me of authority under the guise of protection. The cruelty of it was not in the words themselves but in the ease with which they spoke them, as though plotting to dismantle me were no more consequential than rearranging a seating chart. Zach did not protest. He sighed, weary but complicit, and murmured that I trusted him, that I always had, and Belle laughed, soft and bitter, saying not anymore. The silence that followed was heavier than any shout. I stood in that hallway motionless until their voices drifted into the clink of glasses and the muffled closing of a door. Then I turned away, my steps deliberate, my face calm, because if they believed I would crumble under betrayal they had miscalculated. In my study I retrieved the small recorder Elaine had insisted I keep for dictation, clicked it on, and spoke slowly and clearly, documenting the time, the location, the words I had just overheard. Elaine arrived moments later, her presence steady as always, and without needing explanation she witnessed my statement, signed her name beneath mine, and ensured the record was sealed. By the time Victor received the envelope an hour later, there was no longer a plan whispered in shadows but evidence preserved in ink and voice, a shield waiting for the day it might be needed. I did not cry, not then, because tears would have given them too much power. Instead I poured myself a glass of deep red wine, the same vintage I once opened to celebrate Zach's graduation, and I let the bitterness settle on my tongue like a reminder that survival often tastes harsh before it tastes free. That night I understood something new. The first betrayal had cut through affection, but this second one carved into intent, and once you hear your own child plotting the mechanics of your downfall, there is no return to innocence. The scar it leaves is not loud, it is quiet, a shift in the marrow that tells you love must now share its space with vigilance. From that moment forward I no longer saw myself as a mother defending her legacy, but as a sovereign guarding her kingdom. And in that role hesitation was a luxury I could not afford. In the days that followed I did not confront Zach or Belle directly, I did not demand explanations or deliver ultimatums, because true authority does not raise its voice, it rearranges the room until silence itself becomes allegiance, and so I began to move in ways they could not see, subtle and deliberate, like a hand rearranging pieces on a chessboard while the opponent still thinks it is their turn. I arranged a quiet luncheon with women I had known for decades. Women whose names never appear in newspapers, but whose opinions shape galleries, universities, endowments, and clubs that quietly decide who belongs and who doesn't. Over porcelain plates and pale wine I did not mention betrayal or scandal. Instead I let slip fragments of truth, that I was stepping back from family bureaucracy, that I had grown weary of carrying the weight of legacy through people who mistook it for entitlement, that I was now redirecting my energy to initiatives for women who had no safety net at all. They listened, nodding as women do when one of their own finally admits she is done sacrificing herself, and by the end of that meal I knew the narrative had begun to shift, because power in society is not held by those who shout but by those who whisper at the right tables. Within days I heard that Belle's little foundation had lost a sponsor, that an event was rescheduled to avoid proximity to the Sinclair fundraiser, that invitations once addressed jointly to Zach and me now carried only my name or none at all. These were not coincidences. They were recalculations. Zach, unaccustomed to operating without the invisible scaffolding of my reputation, began to stumble. At the quarterly board meeting which I deliberately skipped for the first time in 12 years, he tried to reassure donors with a speech about continuity, but the minutes recorded a silence after his words, and Victor, seated 2 chairs away, finally said aloud what everyone was thinking: standing in someone's shadow leaves you uncertain of your own shape. Meanwhile I turned my attention to the ghost portfolio, the investments and properties I had built quietly over decades, never flaunted, never listed publicly, Assets Zach assumed were simply part of the family fortune but which in truth I controlled entirely. I began to divest piece by piece, not in a way that caused collapse but in a way that unsettled. A hotel chain sold, a licensing deal reassigned, a dormant patent suddenly reactivated under a non-profit carrying my own signature. By the end of the week, nearly a third of the successes Zach boasted about had evaporated, leaving him holding air while society whispered that perhaps he was not the architect of anything after all. And still I did not confront him, because the absence of my presence was louder than anger. Each evening Elaine would join me in the garden, clipboard in hand, noting which allies had shifted, which invitations had been rescinded, which donations had been redirected, and together we watched as perception slowly but steadily tilted away from Zach and Belle toward me, not through spectacle but through the quiet acknowledgement of where power truly resided. I felt no thrill of revenge, only the steadiness of reclamation, because by then I no longer sought to punish my son, I sought only to make clear to the world, and to myself, that I had never been erased, that I was the foundation beneath their glittering facade, and that I alone decided how long it would stand. When the final week arrived, I no longer felt like a guest inside my own empire. I felt like the architect dismantling a structure that no longer served its purpose. And with each document signed, each call redirected, I carved away the illusions Zach and Belle had tried to weave around me, until nothing remained but clarity. I called Victor one last time, not to discuss contracts or trusts, but to dictate a statement that would go to the press without warning or prelude. And in that single page I withdrew my name entirely from Sinclair Holdings, announced that every expansion fund once promised would be rerouted to the Sinclair Initiative, a foundation of my own design that supported women, students, and builders who understood the value of legacy because they had clawed it from nothing. When the release dropped, the phone lines erupted, investors scrambled, society pages speculated, but I did not answer. I simply sat on the porch of my lakeside cottage, tea in hand, watching the still water mirror the sky, and felt the quiet satisfaction of having chosen myself at last. Zach tried to call, his voice tired in the voicemails he left, apologies layered over fear, insisting he never meant for things to go this far, begging for a chance to talk, and eventually we did meet, not in the grand estate or the crowded ballroom, but in a modest park halfway between his crumbling city world and my chosen refuge. He looked older, thinner, stripped of the polish Belle had once insisted he wear like armor, and when he spoke his words were halting, an attempt to confess regret without truly understanding it. I listened but did not soften, because forgiveness is not a door you hand someone, it is a mirror they must face. And when I told him that I raised a son but he chose instead to become an ambition, his shoulders sagged beneath the weight of truth. There were no tears, no reconciliation, only the recognition that some bonds cannot be repaired once trust has been weaponized. When he left, I remained seated beneath the trees, the wind carrying away the remnants of what we once were. And I felt not rage but peace, the peace of no longer negotiating my worth in exchange for loyalty. In the days that followed, I finished packing my office, 40 years of sketches and awards sealed into boxes marked Legacy, Private, and as Elaine loaded the last of them into storage, I left behind nothing but a brass nameplate that read Margaret Sinclair, founder past tense. From that moment the company was theirs to pretend over, but the essence, the true spirit, had already gone with me. The newspapers framed it as retirement, society whispered it was a feud, but to me it was liberation. At the cottage the air was different, lighter, filled not with the constant hum of expectation but with the simple rhythm of waves against the shore. Elaine joined me each morning for walks. Victor still called to update me on the foundation's progress, but otherwise the silence was my own, and for the first time in years silence did not feel like erasure, it felt like respect. One afternoon as the sun lowered over the water I thought about legacy again. How it had been twisted into a currency at my son's wedding, how Belle had treated it like a stage prop, how Zach had mistaken it for scaffolding to lean on, and I realized that legacy is not an empire, not a surname, not even wealth, it is memory protected by dignity, it is choosing who gets to carry your story forward, and I had finally chosen wisely. That night I dreamed not of confrontation or betrayal but of my own hands building again, shaping futures that had nothing to do with inheritance or entitlement, futures that belonged to those who understood the cost of creation. And when I woke I smiled because for the first time in a long time, my life was no longer about being someone's mother or someone's benefactor. It was simply about being myself, whole and unbroken, a woman who stepped out of the shadows and reclaimed her place in the light.